All right. Thank you very much, Karen. Would you like to start?
I will happily start. So I've never done a poetry reading like this. I'm betting that none of you have done a poetry listening like this either. How strange, but sort of how wonderful too. So I was thinking that, I was thinking about the special power of poetry. And I say that as somebody who reads poetry a lot more than she writes poetry. Is so grateful for poetry for its special weirdness and its special power. And sometimes doing readings in public, like in actual venues when people are actually there, are like super awkward. So then I thought, well, maybe this one could be less awkward because we actually have control over whether we want to have, let's say, audio with no visual or visual with no audio. No, that's not going to work. So I thought what we could try is to have me reading poetry without you guys looking at me and without me looking at you. I feel like when I'm at poetry readings, I kind of always want to close my eyes anyway. And I can be distracted by what's happening around me when I really just want to be able to listen. So what I'm going to do shortly is I'm going to ask, maybe I'll just stop my own video. Hopefully I don't turn the mute off, but so it's not just poetry that has a special power, but all of us are also readers. And I've often thought about how pleasurable it is to read a novel, because I get to experience like this sort of super engine of the human imagination that is like absolutely fired up in reading a novel or in poetry. It's such a private world, and what's happening with every word that's coming into me, and the way that my own private imagination is rendering that into whatever that novel is about. And it's almost always the case that if I go to see a film, I don't know if this is the experience of other folks, but it's very, very, very rare. I can only think of maybe one or two films where I've read the novel or the screenplay that the film was based on, and I've found the film to be superior to the experience of reading it in the first place. Because the vividness of the details that are available to us when we're just in our own minds, filling in whatever is happening around the words, is, for me at least, it's like the movie that is rendered is just pales in comparison. So I was thinking of an example of, like, I really, really love the book Atonement by Ian McEwan. And there's a scene in that book, I remember reading it, when the main character comes down the stairs and she's wearing a emerald green dress. And in my mind, that image is so strong that I'll probably never forget it. But then when I saw the film, which was an okay film as far as I'm concerned, but that scene when Keira Knightley enters with that emerald green dress, there was such a lack of sort of resonance between those two experiences I had of that same scene. So I think it's really, really beautiful that we treasure the ways in which our own imagination can just be fired up fully, and maybe taking the visual element out of that is often one of the keys to doing that, trying to not make it into a picture or something that we're looking at. So I think we're going to try that tonight with poetry, although there are some like fantastic images that the Guelph Civic Museum has pulled out of their archives to, I guess, to create sort of synchronous sensibility with the poems that I'm going to read. And I hope that it's a really good experience for you folks. But what I'm going to do over in my corner of the world, might be close or far from where you are, is I'm just going to turn my video off, and I'm going to just hold on to an object that is an object that has a lot of power for me. And it'll turn out that this object is connected to the poems. They'll probably show up in the poems, but I can show you what it is. This is a Mohawk carving of a pike. And so I'm just going to have this in my hand when I read the poems to you. And you can have something in your hands. I'm just going to give you a few seconds to, like, you know, get up and move around and reach for something. It can be a glass of wine and something. This isn't like, this is a conjunctive synthesis, not a disjunct. But this poetry book, poems are exquisitely powerful because they're both entirely speculative in the imagination, and they're just wandering off on the power of words. But at the same time, poetry, at least this book, is absolutely and totally grounded in a very local, very everyday, concrete set of facts of the matter. A certain kind of soil, certain kind of fish species that tends to be found at a confluence of these very particular rivers. So that's what's sort of magical and difficult, is that you've got this sort of wildly speculative, abstract lift from poetry. But at least the poems that I love and the ones that I try to build have as much of a kind of gravitational pull toward the concrete objects that are the ones that I bumped into. Really, I bump into them in the building of these poems. So if you don't have anything nearby, or maybe you just have, I don't know, what do you have? You like your purse or something banal, that's fine. But I'm gonna just hold this Mohawk carving of a pike while I read to you. Is everybody ready? Okay, thanks for the nods. So I want to thank Gasbro Press for publishing this book of poetry and making, as they do every single book, an exquisite object to hold in your hands. And I want to thank the Grand River for the incredible sense of belonging that it enables human and other creatures, including trees and birds and butterflies and unwanteds like viruses and butternut cankers. And I want to acknowledge that we're in a complex territory where many, many layers of peoples and creatures and material and physical forces have been working together, and sometimes against each other, for 100,000, 10,000, 1,000, 1 year. All right, I'm going to start with the epigram, and I might ask you guys a question at the end. You can ask me questions, but I might ask you a question because this really interests me, and I wonder, I just would like to hear your sense of this as well. So the epigram is from Aristotle's Poetics, and the epigram reads as follows. The difference between the historian and the poet consists really in this, that the one describes the thing that has been, and the other a kind of thing that might be. So last night I was able to participate in the incredible long teaching and multi-layered teaching of my friend and so co-citizen Jeremy Shute, and I was thinking it was a historical, like a very rich historical account. And then I was grateful to Jeremy for offering a context, really an intimate context, as he and his family canoed the Grand down from Guelph toward, well, they're heading toward the Atlantic Ocean, but it was a historian's account and a poetic account. At least what I think Aristotle is suggesting is that a poetic account and a historical account have different powers. And I think that's why I write poetry rather than history, even though this is a densely historical book of poetry. All right, now I'm going to close my video so we can hear me. The first poem I'm going to read is quite short. It's called Fish and Game, or What is to be Had. Remember, the river banks and floodplain lands are privately owned. Camping in a farmer's field without written permission is a violation of the Trespass Act. Excellent meals can be provided on board, daytime and evening, cruising about the River Bell in summer months with advanced reservations. After the survey, after the fullest extent of the river was discovered, it was decided to limit the extent of Indian land from the mouth. No conflict with these. Activities will be encountered all along the river's edge, and recreation is to be had. The next poem I'm going to read to you tonight is called When North Flows South. When North Flows South. And this poem is a very, very long poem. So get comfortable if you haven't managed to get comfortable yet. My cat is on top of my jacket on the floor, so the cat's good. When North Flows South. This poem sits in the very center, physical center of this collection of poems. And so as you're actually moving, as we do in reading English, written English, we're moving from left to right. We're going to sort of pass from left to right, so to speak, in the book. But this poem is interested in the fact that things flow in both directions. And if you're reading the same book of poetry that was translated into Farsi or Arabic, you would be reading, as we would say, from right to left. And we'd cross this middle and it would be flowing in the different direction. So the directions are, depend on where you start, where you're headed. And I'm very, very interested in both the ways that something like the river itself is not just moving in one direction all at once, that if you think about it as a participant in the water cycle, it's moving up, it's moving backwards, it's moving down, it's moving up onto the land in winter. And also, I'm super inspired by the work of Gilles Deleuze and his writings about time and temporality, and that time itself also doesn't necessarily just move in a tick-tock, 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 one direction from birth to adolescence to adulthood. It definitely does seem to move in that direction, but maybe it also flows in many directions at the same time. So this poem is called When North Flows South. And the epigram is from Gilles Deleuze, a philosopher, a French philosopher, and it's from a book of his called The Logic of Sense. And the epigram reads, "It pertains to the essence of becoming, to move and to pull in both directions at once." The pink lace of the wild crab apple froths up out of the Carolinian cleavage, froths up in late May or early June. 200 years ago, the Pennsylvania Deutsch arrived in wooden wagons, and they took up on the northern edge of the natural range of the wild apple, Malus coronaria. The Scots came by boat 2 decades later, followed on foot by those loyal to the crown, the Dodges, the Langdons, the Kilbrides, the Crookstons. They took up on all the rest. Our evidence suggests that the spatial structuring of community diversity developed rapidly in the first year. Membership was facilitated and constrained within the first few months of formation, including stochastic processes at the initial stages of assembly. I-beams and Holsteins, fire-forged soot, black, iron awls, stables, and dung and stone stack walls. These and their people formed an unbroken chain the length of the river from Erie to its source on either side. Appears on many early maps as the Ooze. Augustus Jones himself surveyed it by mistake as the Ooze at the Conestoga west of Aramasa, now the south branch of the Speed. The Speed River enters the Grand like an infinite otter, absorbed into faster water and gushes south as if it was the only one. 50 feet across and with a stony bottom, perpetually suiciding off the limestone viaduct. It's a married stream. It's entering in the main. She runs hard and straight as a plumb line from here. 42 degrees, 29.2 north, 80 degrees, 21.3 west. Hypothesis. On the off chance, the off-leash trails ahead. In October, the dog lopes. I crunch a Macintosh or an Empress, Browning, the core pitched, thoughtless, a dog zigzagging, a red-backed vole. Under the leaf skirts, a rustle, a wolf. A wolf ahead emerges from the dappled shade. The pre-European plant cover of this site is undocumented, but the presence of century-old bur oaks suggests an open and possibly grass-dominated system. Stump-burned, perfect, Punnett squares of prairie spade, bared, it's the shoulder of the Carolinian slope. And then they planted apples. Hound and I pass a solitary bur oak. It's on the Blair Road at the fork of the Aramasa and the Grand. It's still a little bit alive. The outermost layer is photosynthesizing. Circles the dogs sniff the old bones of Nat Dodge's cabin. It's not much either. 1784. Literature review. Knit pips moldering, endospermic cargo. Across the ribs of the North Atlantic, through the rut named Ohio, in a handkerchief, here comes the puny chestnut-colored promises from the old world, spit, pocketed. If they ever get there, they might eat something that tastes like home. Prune and graft, splice and sucker, knock-knee ladder it up and over the split cedar rail, crutches, jam it in the armpits of her drooping limbs. Emasculated, flowering in the balloon stage, thrips twine the stack boxes of borrowed bees. The borrowed bees are circling the fluid, flush-faced orchard, pinked the very moment that June lets her heat leak out. Blossom. An apple is a plain fruit occurring in many parts of the world as an introduced exotic. Reference, Paul Cron, Brian Hughes Band, quote, hybridization and the reproductive pathways mediating gene flow between native Malus coronarius, and domestic apple, Malus domestica. It's in Botany, 87-9, 2009 pages, 864 to 874. Tit round, a fleshy haploid, a peckful and a handful of hips, pinched at the waist, every flesh imaginable, every skin tone, every shape of the lips, different again at the tongue. It's universes of fruit muscle, red, green, yellow, speckled, russet, white on white, rosy pink, dog piss yellow, hard, soft, wet, pucker. Novel phenotypic traits were developed through a variety of breeding technologies. To date, 57 applications for field trials of genetically modified apples have been submitted to the USDA. Catch and release. Apples formed a sub-tribe. They drifted from the rich and powerful family Rosaceae. The rich and powerful family Rosaceae included important food crops, plums, raspberries, peaches, strawberries, pyrus, punas, fragarius, and rubus, and even commonly grown ornamentals. Example, rosa. Roses come in wild, and roses come in common too. Though populations of immigrant species tended to fluctuate more considerably from year to year. Each population was grown in soil collected from each site that had either been sterilized or not to synchronize germination and to ensure each germline was at least made of 12 viable seeds. At Thanksgiving, here we are. At Thanksgiving, here we are at table. Here we are together. The hard harvest is in. The black and white photo confirms what appears to be a family, Augustus Jones and Joseph Brandt. A relationship strengthened when Jones married a Mohawk woman with whom he had 8 children. In one trial, DNA content proved intertwining branches. In some cases, it was worrisome to those who could recall the days when the North flowed south. Concurrently, Jones had a relationship with a Mississauga Indian woman that produced 2 more children. Across a fertility gradient, the rose, the dog rose, the apples, the apple-cheeked, loyal-footed children and their children's roots, sampled for the colonization assessment, bodies that grew flesh, every adaptation, every note, every tone, every red, green, yellow, speckled, russet, white, white on white, rosy pink, dog piss yellow, every black, white, brown, everyone, every schimmelpferd, chestnut mare, and all tones upward of pure. Method. 28 isolates from 23 locations throughout North America sequence the data for all isolates. They're deposited in GenBank, trademark. No differences in the sequences of the 5 genes. Among the 28 isolates were observed, the majority rule consensus tree from Bayesian analysis was included. See figure 1 with Bayesian posterior probabilities and maximum parsimony and neighbor joining bootstrap values included on each node. The results of the phylogenetic analysis, see figure 2, demonstrate that SC-J, hereafter referred to as OC-J, forms a monophyletic group, 100% posterior probability, 99% MP, and 100% NJ bootstrap values within the family, with other members of that genus more closely related to other members of the family G than to the species in the genus S, F. That's from Kirk Broders and Jake Boland. Article, Reclassification of the Butternut Canker Fungus, Sirococcus cligowenti, juglandicerum, into the genus. That's in Fungal Biology, if you want to look it up, 115, page 70 to 79. Skin it. Skin it then. Skin it with a steel edge, with opposing thumbs. There's the blood. All the blood. All the blood is blood red. Malus domestica trees appear to be more advanced in flowering, suggesting an earlier start than Malus culinaria. Your recent barn stands in the damp grass. It stands in the damp grass of the baby orchard, watching the flowering crab and their showy brides waltzing it up there on the Wisconsin glacial till. The genetic integrity of native species does not appear threatened by the introduction of domestics, for the most part. Null hypothesis. All the streaming, all the sloshing in closed quarters, steamy gunwales below the horizontal weather of watercraft. The watercraft is a single shared rib cage with opportunities for hybridization. Yet the thick spermatic coils of type twist about the axes of sameness, otherwise discrete taxa, in neighborhoods, in ports, a shy pair glued to each other below deck, on the school swings, in the viscous nucleolus. Selection pressures are for reduced interactions, but underneath the water table, a whelped abiotic mass is welded to the base of this accident-free record. Invasion and range expansion estimates. Like pulls like. Itself pulls its other half. One pull pulls hard. Tense. Travois. The coffin ships from Sligo, several on the Christian ark, everyone and anyone, cheek to jowl, brothers and sisters, twins of every sort, twinned, too much time on their hands. The probability of mating between cross-compatible species, statistically insignificant, for the most part. Confirmation hypothesis. An apple and a rose are posing for a still life, lying side by side, awkward in the absolute metabolic gulag of controlled laboratory conditions. M. coronaria and M. domestica intermixed within the site, risking extensive interspecific flowering overlap, despite previous reports showing that the native and introduced gene pools remain distinct. The high proportion of hybrid seeds suggest there is a significant potential for gene flow from domestic apples back into native M. coronaria populations, full stop. The hard rain and the buckthorn. The hard rain and the buckthorn bully the mail order children into grain and empire, sweet-talking rose thugs into housewares. First generation, F1 hybrids exhibited almost zero viability. Conclusion. In the overall enterprise of fitness, we are husbandry and burning and forcing, and selective reduction and slaughter and outcrossing and end of season barn dance. And 200,000 years of tinkering and fish too far south of where they were. In the practices of population management, we are the distance we leave between things and the direction we make them flow. The tall grass prairie and the oak savannas that cover an estimated 100,000 hectares of southwestern Ontario at the time of European settlement, today less than 5% remains. The forward edge of the range of natural history, it was delivered in foil packets to the northernmost rim of the Carolinian forest. In Waterloo region, that crested like a tidal bore and pivoted south. It was as if someone had grabbed nature, like a hall carpet and shook her hard. The rain climbed the clouds. The Grand River walked barefoot back to a burbling spring west of Alton and was received as both prodigal and stranger. The oak-shaped shade of this old bur oak, it knows the exact moment Nathaniel Dodge stopped pushing north and began to farm. Drab clay and sandy loams preponderating. Dairy cows, laying hens, commercial meat, rabbits, broilers, stewing hens, some evidence of equine industry. Barn paint flakes off into Crookston Creek. The farm dog sniffs near the ice house, sniffs near the ice house slit, and the farm dog whines. Coyotes get bolder. Like all things with stomachs, their home range dilates with hunger. 50 feet closer each morning, the kitchen door, the white-tailed deer, they've come to lick the fructose off our abandoned orchard. Figures. An 18-hectare agricultural field, relatively homogeneous in topography, drainage, and soil depth, less than 2 meters to the bedrock, is bounded by old field to the north and east, and a residential hedgerow and road to the west and south, the Blair Road. 24 native late successional tallgrass prairie species were seeded over an environmentally homogeneous agricultural field. Corn, soybean rotation, corn, soybean rotation, corn, soybean rotation, more than 60 years, devoid of vegetation. At the time of planting, base stock parameterized, 100 by 100 long chains of management, decades of plowing, decades of herbicide application. Directions for future research. The Pennsylvania Deutsch, the Soggy Scots, the Irish up in Pilkington Township, stained and chipped like teeth, they arrived to a pink May or a pink June, and they were not wishing to meet what was already there. To have started out hard like they did, hasping the fangs off their home range, pre-poisoning what was up ahead until it radiated back a black not baying, not pacing, a black not pacing the fur-fluffed dens, a black not in heat, not cold-blooded, absolutely nothing beyond the kerosene reach to greet. Absolutely nothing beyond the kerosene reach to greet them but an orderly threading of placid cattle through the night air to one door, to the hay, to a safe regional story like one lit window they all huddled behind. In the time it took to get here, in the time it takes to count history in our heads, in that amount of time, the orchards and the disc plow and the plowed fields went missing, and the grasslands and the uppermost, most alive zone of the Wentworth soil column and the grasslands that had been built out of all their shitting and rotting. This went missing too. And those who came from this place and those who came to this place, honeybees and native bees, these are also moving in all directions. And most of the trees. So I thought I'd talk a little bit, if you wanted to hear about how I built those poems, or what my, I guess what my method was for building those poems. And, you know, connected to that is why I did it like that. And there's lots of different angles I could come in about that, but I think I can start. I haven't rehearsed this, but I think I can start by drawing attention to the word folk ecology that I basically coined for the purposes of this work. Is you cannot tell the story of the peoples who have managed to make it to a place, whether it's from Sudan to Guelph or from Pennsylvania to Waterloo. You can't tell that story well without the story of what the conditions of the mud were and what the conditions of the weather were when they arrived, and what could be grown and what couldn't be grown, and how the air smelled different, and whether the water was flowing in the directions that they were used to or not. And what we often see if we study history is that we're actually taught human history, and that human history is told as if the trees and the grasses and the creatures and the worms and the bacteria and the rivers were somehow a kind of like picturesque backdrop to this sort of grand human narrative. And I think I've always hated those. And I don't know if it's because I myself, as a small person, was really drawn to creeks and swamps and trails in the woods and mushrooms and bark, and all the other little friends like the frogs and the toads and the slugs. But it's never felt to me as though there's an I somehow that's not in this sort of greater we, and that greater we isn't just like my mom and my dad and my kids and everything. It includes those human others, but it's just never been the case that I've ever been able to see my personal history or the history of, let's say, you know, Western settlement in North America in this area as just a human history. But it's not often told that way. And on the other side, you could study botanical histories. You could study the history of species, the movement of species. In this case, let's say apples and food species, or grasslands and trees. And, you know, whether it's a treatise from 200 years ago or a paper that's just been published in Tree Ecology in the last month, there's going to be a sort of excision of, or an attempted excision of, the fact that humans are there with the trees, under the trees, sleeping under the trees, using the trees to build, learning sounds from the trees, imitating trees. And it probably goes both ways in interesting ways that we can't really even sort of wrap our heads around. So folk ecology, what I wanted to do is like absolutely forge the idea of the folk, you know, the people, the history of the peoples, the early peoples. In this area, the folk tends to be, let's see, the German Mennonites, or the Irish up north, or, you know, sort of more locally in Guelph, the Italians that came post-war. But I wanted to forge that absolutely to the watershed that those folks arrived in or moved through. So that's one thing. But I also, the other sort of cleavage, it's a bit of a false cleavage. It's good. Poetry is great because you say cleavage and you just think, cleavage, cleavage. There's 3 or 4 different senses of that word. And when you write poetry, all of those are actually working together. All of them are deliberately in play. Like the first line from that book, from the poem I just read you, When North Flows South, is the pink lace of the wild crabapple froths up out of the Carolinian cleavage. And so you can take that as you want, but it can definitely be like a kind of frothy, bosomy forest. And sometimes, you know, the trees at the top, they look remarkably lacy like that. Anyway, another cleavage that you find that's just a sort of formality, an artifact of a certain way of having decided to divide up either libraries or education or sequence of education, sort of post-contact and pre-contact, as though the people's pre-European contact in this areas sort of stopped being present post-contact, or as though somehow there was no like significant reciprocal mixings of all levels, genetic, knowledges, transmission modes, bacteria and viruses. Nothing's just moving in one direction. They're moving in both directions. And so if we want to write, let's say, poetically about Indigenous peoples in this area, we can't just say we're going to write a history, because that makes it sound as though Indigenous peoples were just a part of history and they're not, or we're not all here still in some incarnation. So it's true, we can say, for instance, as Jeremy said last night, the Attawandaron Nation, or the sometimes called the Chiladon Nation, don't seem to be a nation that's visible, intact, and fly a flag in this region anymore. But the bloods of the Attawandaron Nation's people are in the soil, in the trees, in the peoples, probably in the animals. There's a kind of here-ness to it. That's really remarkable. So the cleavages that we learn about pre-contact and post-contact, those are important for some reasons, but the cleavage is not decisive and complete. It's not just one or the other. So I'm really interested in my work in the stuff that kind of gets mixed in and mixes in, and also then like the political reaction to miscegenation. Like one of the most fascinating sort of anthropological, biological things is to read about the reaction of biologists in the US in the late 19th century to racism and slavery and the so-called threat of the mixing of the races, and then how biology sort of mounted this story that race is this kind of thing that can't blend at the level of blood or genes, nobody should worry. But at the same time, we have sort of very, very famous biologists like Louis Agassiz, who had probably one, probably many Black female lovers. So I also wanted to sort of mix all that messiness into this kind of a folk ecology. So I talk about some of the white folk that are heralded as sort of major groundbreakers, literally groundbreakers around here, like Augustus James Jones, who was a surveyor for the Upper Canada, for the Canadian Company under John Galt. Those of us who live around here, we know that there's something called Jones Baseline, which is supposed to have cut directly up from current day Burlington and head all the way up. But if you look at the map, it gets all wonky because he got disoriented and misidentified a river and thought he was on the Conestoga when he was actually on the north end of maybe the Maitland. Anyway, if you look at the map, it's amazing. That's why around here we've got like triangle townships rather than this square grid, which I'm kind of grateful for that mistake. But Augustus James John, I didn't know this till I was doing my research, and you do research in funny ways. Like you don't just go to one source and you find out that he had, you know, 2 sets of wives, and they were First Nations women, and he had many children, some with the Mohawk Nation, some with the Mississaugas of the Credit Woman. And so these stories about how important it is to keep things apart, the reassurances we get from politics and economics and biology that don't worry, those things might mix, but they're not viable when they mix. So all of that stuff about apples, it's really, even though it's written in the idiom of 21st century genetics, I feel like it's just the same sort of tale that's being told under a different story. Is don't worry, the wild things and the domesticated things, they have different schedules, they have different levels of purity, they're not going to mix, things move from the primitive to the domestic, everything's getting better, this is progress, don't worry. And it's really interesting because then you see these sort of footnotes that say, oh shit, it looks like the domestic apples genes are flowing backwards or in the other direction into the wild. And that throws off a great number of narratives about what's feral and what's domestic, what to worry about, how close things are, what this cat is here that's at my feet. And for some people that mixing is extremely horrifying, but for some reason it's just not horrifying to me. And I wanted to make a weird mashup history of the place where we live in this watershed that contained all of those different efforts to sort of tell the story about how things are going and where they're going. And it was very, very interesting to me doing the research for this work, which I did in archives, but also by living on the land and talking to scientists and reading their articles that they'd written based on data that they'd extracted in the watershed. Just like any kind of bizarre, anarchic archaeological method and that's really the only way that you can sort of bring to the surface something that has a coherence, even in its kind of incoherence, it has a profound coherence. So what's said at the level of genetics is what's said at the level of bacteriology, what's said at the same level of trees, what's said at the same level of peoples of the past and also peoples of the present. So those are some of the impulses behind it. And you would have heard, of course, that I slightly ironically, but also in a way of honoring scientific research, I decided to sort of break up the sections of that long poem into the sections that any peer-reviewed journal at this point would need to divide their data and their research findings into. So how are we at? Where are we at, Beth? How are we? I can't see Beth.
Hi, Karen. I'm here.
Hi, Beth. Do you want to weigh in? You want to take the temperature? Maybe you can take your own and then kind of generalize. Do we have time for one more poem, or do you want us to open it up for questions at this point?
Well, it's entirely up to you, Karen. The only thing that I have here is that I was going to put up the link to your book. I don't know if you want to your book publisher. Do you want me to do that now and then ask for questions, or I'm not
this here. Well, what is say?
It's not exactly.
You know what we can do? There's got to be some kind of a survey function on this. Participants. Hi, Chris Chanter. Do you want one more poem, Chris? Hi, Susan Buchanan. Are you saying yes? I'm just going to look at one person. Chris, short, long, medium. She's nodding very vigorously.
Okay. Great.
Okay, Tanis says, I would love a poem because I just arrived. Hi, Tanis.
That's great. So if anybody would like to join in, let them go ahead and do that. But I think we're going to have another poem now.
Sure, that's fine. Thanks, Beth.
Great.
I wonder if there's any requests too, because I know that there's some folks who know this book quite well. I think Meg is there. I think Rachel's there.
If anyone has any requests, just enter them into the chat box there.
Put a $5 bill in my open guitar case. Okay, Chris says he has to go, and she has to go in a few minutes. I want to ask Leslie what she wants to hear, because Leslie was on the river for so long. Leslie, what do you want to hear? Do you have a request? Leslie and I had a nice exchange yesterday where she said that reading my poem after she'd been canoeing on that river for such a long time was a very interesting, intimate experience. And I wasn't on the river in that way, so I really appreciate that perspective. Leslie, do you have a request?
I have unmuted you, Leslie, if you'd like to.
Hi, Les.
I think I have. Oh, I haven't. Here, let's try that again. Oh, I don't seem to be able to. I don't know why. I'm afraid maybe you could answer by just entering a note in the chat box, Leslie? Sorry about that. I don't know why it's not.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Or they hired. Well, it was URG police. So yeah.
I don't seem to be able to unmute one person without unmuting everyone. So Karen, oh dear.
What have we done?
There, somehow, there you go, okay.
I think I'll read Stream Loggers. It's really interesting writing poetry. I don't know what it's like for other people to write poetry, but I don't have a sense of ownership about like what this poem means. I think that would be a bit weird. I think it would be like saying that you have an ownership over a cloud or something. I'm just thinking about that in the background. But hi, Omanisa. So I wrote this poem, Stream Loggers, and as far as I understand it, stream loggers are a kind of instrument that are used by hydrologists, that they leave it in creeks or streams or water to test the flow, to test the depth, all of that. So it's a name of an instrument used by hydrologists, stream loggers. But also, I mean, just thank goodness language is so wonky, because the word stream loggers, when I first heard it, I thought of beavers that, you know, annoyingly cut the trees that get planted every year by the GRCA and folks, and they end up in the river, and then they're logs in the stream. And then I also thought that, imagine if you were a stream logger and it was your job and you had to go and log the stream, which, what would that mean? But something like carrying bits of water out? I don't know. Anyway, I liked the fact that I don't really know what this means, but it's something. So I wrote this poem because one of the things I learned when I was a writer in residence on this 900 hectare site called Rare, which is runs along the Grand, just a little bit north of Cambridge. Is that right?
Yes, I think so.
In any case, I ran into scientists who are working on it's a research, it's kind of just an outdoor research lab for anybody who wants to do research. And so there's some hydrologists there, and they were logging the flow rate from something called an ephemeral stream into a regular stream. And so I wanted to know what an ephemeral stream was. It just, maybe I didn't want to know, because ephemeral stream just sounds so fantastic. But it turns out that they're just very different kinds of streams. They behave differently. They have a different relationship to roots and to grasses and to seasons. So I became interested in how bodies of water that I thought were roughly the same are different. I'm really interested in things that seem the same but are actually different. I'm interested in how they interact, and if they interact the way that I assume. And in my mind, that made me think about my parents and them meeting as two individuals and falling in love, and they're different, and how did they figure things out, and how did they work it out? What was their story? So I was thinking about trying to tell the story of a coupling of difference, whether it's a man or a woman, or two men, or friends between a dog and a cat, or I don't know, the grasslands and the edge of the forest. So things that are like radically different lives that end up being able to knit an edge together, and it to be a kind of a coupling. I was really interested in these two different kinds of streams. So anyway, I wrote this poem, and I read somewhere, somebody said, this is the most erotic thing I've ever read. I was like, I had absolutely no intention of that, but I'm perfectly happy that that happened. So, but I just thought I'd forefront it by that, because I was really surprised. And I think I just want to say, whatever you hear in this, just trust that you're hearing what you hear in this. And I've set it up as this kind of many meaning scaffolding so that all of those can happen. And maybe if you're one of the hydrologists that I'm quoting here, so maybe R. Bamji and J.B. Lindsay, if you're listening there, maybe for you this is just a really poorly written scientific article about hydrology and earth system sciences, but that's fine. So I'm going to read Stream Loggers. And the epigram here is from Ludwig Wittgenstein from his work on certainty. And the epigram says, it swallows the consequence down, so to speak, together with what it learns. Stream Loggers. One man and one woman park the government jeep on the gravel shoulder of the Grand River Watershed. Paired, they walk through chest-high Queen Anne's lace, lime-tufted burdock, to a barbed wire fence, growing into the flesh of the Bauman tree line. He steps it down for her. She climbs over him into the automatic quiet of the Hog's Backwoods. Stiff rubber boots, stiff rubber gloves. Nothing is pliable. There's a ridge between them, squeaking slightly as they trudge. Ephemeral streams expand and contract with variation in basin moisture conditions. Some flow during wet seasons, and others are episodic, only flowing during and for short periods after heavy rainfall. Or snow melt, an ephemeral creek. It's not a snack-sized river. It won't become a river given a little time. It is a hydrologic imperfection, a profound coupling of aquatic and terrestrial systems. It is the horizon of water and dirt. The role headland areas play in the dynamics of the entire watershed in predominantly agricultural basins, it's especially important as the modification and location of these streams has a great effect on downstream water quality and downstream water quantity. One man and one woman in simulated conditions with limited supply, they have gone on ahead. Heading out too early, it's still pitch dark. That the design would not fail, that the direction of flow, it was not as expected during laboratory setup. The headwaters of Crookston Creek, a tiny region of wet, functioning in the spongy lungs of unlogged spruce, of juvenile seep-ins, of field tiles from Jim Dam's cash crop, gunning the flow of standing water into a steep, dredged down ditch. A stilling pool, a firstborn, afloat to market a little science dot, a candled egg, upstream with translucent salamanders speckling like a new flashlight shone right on them. The optic nerve, a second spring is born. She senses the join between things. She senses the join between persons as the distance between them, and the rusted wire bites the creek's full tilt, its high quantities of silt, its transportation. There's a sweet spot near the bottom. Near the bottom of the perennial sweet, there's a sweet spot she gives them. She's the one who gives the biggest pools of light. All the length of that ephemeral channel, installed sensors now form a network of sense data. They read flow events and they feed the data into state loggers. A trickle of promises, re-zero, recalibrate. Recalibrate your basic idea of creek. Expansion and contraction, drainage and seepage, discharge and infiltration. wetting and drying events, wetting, drying events, coalescence, disintegration. The idea of creek, the idea of family, the idea of a process of ongoing delivery within the adjacent hill slopes, inconstant expressions, expressions of the ongoing effort of physical and energetic components of an overall state, an absolute whole, the whole of the water and the absolute whole of its ground, togethered, lifting the back legs, entering the wet space, entering the tight coupling. Good. Hi, Dennis. All right, Beth, so I'll let you take command again, and you can relay questions to me if there are any questions or observations or comments.
Okay.
How's that sound?
Well, can you see the chat there? Because I just had, there's a few comments here. I haven't had any questions so far. Does anyone have any questions? Here's one. Oh, somebody's making a comment. Can you see them?
I can see them.
Okay. Well, thanks to everyone for coming. This was absolutely wonderful, Karen. I enjoyed it absolutely tremendously. It was just fantastic. It was such a synthesis of so many things that I've thought over my lifetime about not just this area, but other places as well. And I'd like to thank you so much.
Thanks,
It was
folks.
very, very inspiring.
And there's, I mean, if we had all the time in the world, there's whole sections on reactions to immigrants and newcomers. And I really wanted to embed that into like a biological sort of story, just so that we could sort of hear the things that we end up saying to one another. And so anyway, there's lots of different elements that I didn't get. There's a lot about trees. I didn't talk too much about trees. And then there's surprising Catholicism that shows up. Hopefully this just wet your whistle, but the book is available. You can order it if you want to read it more from Gasbro Press online, but also our wonderful, amazing friends at the bookshelf. All right, thanks everybody for coming. I'm going to put in scare quotes, but it was a very interesting experience. And yeah, audiobook available, Paul. Just this reading, I think. Thanks for listening. I hope that it felt good in the ears.
It was wonderful. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks, Beth. Thanks for moderating it.
Okay.
Okay, bye.
Everyone.
Love to all.